Since I have stuff to display on my screen, I'm going to try to do a quick screen clear to make sure we don't have any permissions issues.
Sure. I was going to get
Okay, the screen share appears to be successful on my side.
excellent.
Okay, I'll stop that. And let you go back to your slides.
All right. I am hoping that I have successfully uploaded your latest slides.
You'll be off by minor points, if at all, so it's not a big deal.
I'm sorry, repeat. Okay, welcome to our June interim of the NETMOD working group. I'm Lou Berger. We also have here Jason Stern and Kent Watson, my co-chair. Jason's our secretary. And if we run into problems, Jason, I'm hoping you can help with that. We also, well, I'll get into the rest in a moment. This is a formal IETF meeting. That means our usual note well applies. Hopefully everyone is familiar with it. I see most people here have been around for a little while. So, or if you're not familiar with it, please take a look at the IETF page and look at the note well. Basically, it says everything we do here becomes part of our permanent and public record. We're using Meet Echo. If you're on here, you've figured that out. Thank you. Please do help with note-taking. Notes would be good to capture discussion, particularly sort of summarizing interesting discussion points. That would be helpful. You do not need to copy down anything that's on the slides. Material has been posted. I just did an update to the BGP slides. I'm hoping that that is the, we'll be able to share the right version. We really only have 2 topics. Interesting, that's supposed to be 5 minutes, but I'm going to shorten to 4. And I'll see if I can do it in 3. The intro is simply what you're hearing right now. And the rest of the time is going to be split between Jeff and Mahesh as they see fit to go through sort of a deep dive of something we touched on at the last IETF and really didn't have enough time, which is what led to this meeting. We are recording this session. The hope is that we have enough good discussion and material that this can be used as a reference to other Yang model writers in the future. And with that, I'm going to try to switch decks and switch over to Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Lou. So while the slides are being loaded, my name's Jeff Haas, and the hat that I'm wearing today is, one of the co-authors with Mahesh on the BGP Yang module. And we're hoping to spend a little bit of time today talking about our experiences and working in Yang and the IETF tool chains for developing, what is a very, very large module and interactions with all the other modules and the sort of very long path that we took to get there. I believe I actually can change slides. I can indeed change slides. So the format that we're hoping to have today.
Just as a heads up, I suspect this is not the updated deck. There were 2 of them listed. I expected to see 3. So just as a heads up, you may be using the older deck.
Okay. The differences between the decks are minor. We'll get the finalized version of the deck for submission to that. It's not a big deal. So the format we were hoping today is that Mahesh and I will take turns sort of talking through a given slide because we have slightly different frames of reference for our experiences and what we each sort of brought to this process. And our intention is to leave this open for discussion because things that we've run into may be useful to other people to discuss in terms of is this a tools issue? Is this a modeling issue? Is this figuring out how to get bits of IETF to work with each other? And the point here is to try to share what wisdom we've actually gotten and ideally seek wisdom from others. And our hope is that long term, some of these things can distill down into other things that can help people at IETF, advance and make progress on their modules, whether they're very large ones like we had to work on or very small ones. So, core lessons wise, this is basically the agenda that we'll be working through today. Biggest thing that you have to worry about when you're working on a module is what's the content and how are the things organized, what's the structure of it. And that's a hard enough task to start with. If you have people that, in the case of protocol modules or similar, if you have somebody that's a reasonable protocol expert, usually that's not a hard thing. Although one of the challenges we have in IETF is that we often do our work incrementally through RFCs that add to things rather than reissuing everything like a one gigantic module like IEEE does as part of their revisions. So the consequence is trying to figure out what exactly are you covering and which features you're actually trying to cover, whether you're trying to make a module that's covering everything or you're planning to do pieces a bit at a time through augmentation modules as an example. And part of that conversation eventually comes down to modeling of things. Are these things features, for example? When you have a core protocol that has a number of things added over the years, how do you handle your modeling in such a way that you can extend the model and basically as part of asking somebody to implement the thing, not effectively asking the support features that they may not actually have. So this is a challenge for certain types of protocols, and we'll get to at least one example of that in BGP as we work through the slide deck. One of the other very large topics that consumed a huge portion of our time was maintainability. How do you actually author a module and know that you will not get it right the first time, that you want to be able to add to it, that you're going to want to deal with these cases where you have new protocol extensions to add in, not only things that are completely brand new, but simply backfilling some of the stuff you may not have chosen to do on day one. And some of the challenges that you have in terms of maintainability is taking care of versioning of the extensible types that the Yang languages give us. And we found this to be one of our big challenges. Share some of our experiences. We are certain, since we haven't actually gotten through RFC status, that people have opinions about how we've done this, and in many cases they may disagree with how they've gone. And hopefully this discussion will help us grow it IETF-wise to figure out how do we solve some of these interesting challenges. And maybe if we go on to revise the Yang language at some point for the next version, are these learnings that we can take on to maybe extend the language to the next round. We'll also hit through a number of examples through things, and it's our experience that not only providing examples for discussion points for slides is a useful way of transferring knowledge, we found that it's necessary as part of the document authoring process to provide examples, integrate them into the tool chains, test them out. These things effectively become our unit tests of proving that we've actually done our work correctly. And this will be one of the slide points that we steadily work our way through. And the examples cover as an example interworking between the various models, because most of our works, some of them are very standalone things, but the vast majority of our protocols don't have completely independent lifespans or fate sharing from each other. So easy consequences are if you have something that refers to interfaces, this will often point off to other standard modules in IETF. These things are fairly well established patterns, and as a consequence, they're well tested. But as we start working on things that are either on the new side of things, like the policy module that we've done in the routing working group, or modules that are working their way through standards like the TCP module, not only have we got it right, have they got it right, but can you use the two things together? And that is a explicit things of testability. And finally, one of the things we're intending to discuss is collaboration. How do we go about actually getting the work done when there's multiple parties? We're scattered around the planet. We have tool chains that we want to have levels of consistency with. We also have necessity of providing some level of trackability for our works, especially for extremely large pieces of work like a Yang module. So, and Rob Wilton mentions in chat, please refer to that. The Yang language itself, if there's issues there, please put it into the Yang next GitHub entry. So this is where I pause and give Mahesh a chance to see if he wants to add to this particular slide.
That is not covered in the code license is, I think, schema mount, but there is a slide to that effect, and we'll talk about it when we get there.
Okay, great. And again, please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt at any time. So, Jason, please go ahead. And Jason, you are not currently audible. Okay, Jason, give you one more try, and then we'll go back to resuming the presentations. Okay, Jason says that he'll fix his audio. I'll come back later. I've switched my headset input. I was noticing I was getting ambient, so hopefully I'm a little bit better to hear at the moment. So structure and content. Before you do any large modeling exercise, you have to know the things that you're talking about. And unfortunately for IETF, we don't really have a lot of good introduction to modeling. We have a lot of people that are deep experts in various protocols. And as a consequence, people usually know what are the sort of nouns of the protocol, what are the things that actually you're talking about, and protocol operations. When we're talking about protocols, usually have some level of verbs and relationships to each other. These things make it significantly easier for somebody that's a protocol expert to do modeling, and sometimes we'll have people that are the protocol experts themselves participating in the process. But just as often, we'll have people that may not be either a modeling expert or a protocol expert trying to contribute. So the biggest piece of work you have to work on is how do you actually draft all the content? The BGP Yang stuff in particular went through a number of iterations, and this is one of the minor points that we did change is we sort of refined our history. So slide point here from IETF 116 was that was originally our thinking that the original BGP Yang work had started by people who began OpenConfig, but as we sort of worked through our IETF data tracker history, found that it actually went back several versions before that. So we see that IETF has deep cycles. Some work actually started IETF. The OpenConfig people got involved, and then eventually they went their own separate way, forking for their own specific needs. And OC has their own culture and goals for things that aren't necessarily the same as IETF's. So this leads to some of the interesting comparison points later on. Easy examples being that the goal for OC is for modeling basically the generic device from a configuration standpoint. Completeness of representation in the protocol stacks is not an explicit goal for them. A more vendor neutral background is what they're looking for. Whereas in IETF, we're trying to provide modeling for the protocols themselves. We may not have quite the same level of focus on configuration, but certainly in terms of operational state, we care about modeling the entirety of the protocols, maybe one step more than they do as a project. This is neither good nor bad. They just simply have places that the overlaps can impact. Specific challenges for BGP, and this is true of a lot of the protocols that have a very long history. BGP is a protocol of many, many extensions, and it took us a lot of years just to get all the content in. And if somebody says, well, what is BGP? These days you go off and say, this is RFC 4271. Well, is everything in here that you need? Not even close. So one of the challenges is, based on the fact that IETF does not issue, basically update RFCs that have absolutely everything that's part of the core anymore. We have to figure out what is the core subset of modern BGP. And the working group didn't have strong opinions on these things. A lot of people seem to have a general sense of things like, well, BGP does route reflection, it does confederations, has a bunch of common extensions like communities that everybody thinks they belong in the core of the protocol. Well, no, these are all extensions, so we have to decide what to do. We drew some lines in the sand, and we got some of them right. We got some of them wrong, and as a consequence, there was an awful lot of feature creep. What this means is that as a consequence, if you throw all the contents into the base model, and you had to go through iterations of, did we do this right? Is it the correct modeling for these things? Is the structure correct? This has to be an iterative process, and it does involve not only passes from people that are protocol experts, but also modeling experts. And as we're sort of get through, is other piece of the presentation is the usability of things correct? So this sort of three-tier re-examination is a necessary part of the process. And as much as the Yang doctors are there to help us on a lot of things about the nature of the language and how to model certain things, they can't help us with everything. They're not experts in the protocols. They won't see things that are missing from the content perspective unless they're also experts in the protocol in question. This becomes a challenge at review time. And again, just to emphasize the final point, this re-examination, from those three perspectives is really important. Mahesh, do you want to add anything here? And Mahesh,
Sorry.
there you go.
Yeah. Okay. What I was trying to say is no, not at this point.
Okay, fine. Pause momentarily to see if there's any questions. And this is theoretically a very basic thing, and certainly for a lot of people, they're going to be on this interim that are core NetMod participants. None of this stuff is technically new, but these slides are written for many of the audiences in IETF, and hopefully this is generically useful. So moving on to features, Yang language is very nice compared to some of the headaches we have to deal with SNMP MIBs, in the sense that it's a little bit easier to do things that are optional. There's no need to have absolutely everything present as a mandatory to implement component inside of your model. And features give us a way to add those optional things in a flexible way. The problem is it complicates the model in many perspectives. Makes it harder for the server to decide what to do in some circumstances, and clients have to understand, through exchange of what features are actually being used by the server to know locally what is actually being handled at the client end of things. From a BGP perspective, we tried to get very hard to go through a core set of features where we had things that were mandatory to implement. We didn't want to have things that were too optional in many circumstances, because in those circumstances it does make it difficult to write things consistently from implementation to implementation, and to try to have a consistent user experience for the base model that we're starting with. So we're really targeting what was core in the language and what was core inside of BGP itself. Places where this got complicated is there's some features that if you don't accommodate for them up front, you can't necessarily handle the modeling changes later, especially based on how the revisions to Yang modules are permitted to do. And in particular, the biggest thing that this is a gotcha to look out for is for list keying. As an example, if you're doing a list of routes, you're not allowed to really change the keys. And that's something you have to get right very close and very upfront. BGP has a optional extension called add paths that allows you to have BGP advertise more than one path between two BGP speakers. And theoretically is an optional feature, you wouldn't think, though, this doesn't have an impact on the protocol. But since you need to be able to model consistently a set of exchanged routes, this means that even if an implementation doesn't support add paths, it's necessary to include the path ID, the path index, as part of the list keys. So this was a piece of looking ahead that was necessary to get the job done right. Augmentation for a lot of the extensions, if you've done your structure of your modules right, which means the key skeleton has to be thought about very hard up front, is where most of the extensions will get added on. And again, we'll emphasize this in later slides, being able to look back and say, do I have enough of a skeleton to add something on that I may want to do later, even if you're not doing it today, can save you an awful lot of your headache. And some of these things may be just simply strict augmentations. This means that from a protocol perspective, you can add things on that doesn't have a lot of complexity, and you don't have to worry about features in a lot of these circumstances. So one of the key learnings here is an attempt to try to think ahead. Can we do the work so that it is done primarily through augmentation without necessarily complicating using the Yang feature statement? Jason, do you want to try again?
Can you guys hear me this time?
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just coming back to the same point I'd raised my hand about before, about features and augmentation. I know in discussions in our versioning work, I just want to reiterate that, this way of doing features and augmentation where things are additive is definitely the right way to go. We've seen in I think 3GPP and some other discussions where sometimes standards-based modules have other modules that deviate those modules. I don't think we've seen it, or at least in our group, we haven't discussed examples in the IETF, but we definitely want to avoid deviations, which is kind of like a subtractive approach. Similarly with features, I know it's built into Yang 1.1 that you can say something like, if not feature foo, then have some leaf. But I know in our discussions, we think there may be some problems and that could cause some problems and be fairly non-intuitive. So like additive things like features where it adds nodes, augmentations where it adds things seem to be pretty safe, but definitely recommend to avoid subtractive type techniques like deviations or not.
Yeah, and sort of to add into your point there, for a lot of IETF style Yang work, hopefully we can do most of these things either through augmentations, because in many cases features are being added in one RFC at a time, and that's usually a good general boundary for doing the augmentations. Where we've seen some headaches, as an example, our inter-vendor comparison. One of the pieces of the work that we try to do is trying to construct what goes into things. A lot of features that are part of the core protocols strictly identifiable by the RFCs, but there's a lot of places also where vendors have added on de facto features over time, and part of the conversation has to be, what do you do about those? If they're so built in but don't have any documentation, it becomes a bit challenging. And one of the things that ends up challenging on them half the time is, how do you model the configuration? Since in a lot of circumstances, since they're not standardized, they end up with interesting quirks to them. They pick an example out of BGP. The BGP route reflector feature has a no client reflect that's pretty consistently implemented by most vendors. But in our modeling work, it turned out that pretty much no vendor had exactly the same place where they allowed configuration for it. So our choice ended up having to be, we were going to skip adding this feature rather than make for complicated deviations out of it. Mahesh, did you have anything you want to add here?
Yeah, actually, I was going to remind you that maybe the route reflect option is one example of where, as Jason mentioned, we want to avoid deviation, but there are cases where we were not able to add the feature simply because of the implementation being different across vendors for that particular feature. The other example I also want to kind of, I'll probably get into is with augmentation is in the schema mount example in particular. But let's get to that slide and I'll talk about the issue that we ran into with being able to simply augment and realize what we wanted to realize. But let's wait for that slide to talk about schema mount and how it affected our model.
Okay, and depending on which slide versions we have uploaded, that may be one you have to display from your desktop. So maybe have that one available if we have to do that. So one of the other big buckets of things we had to worry about, and this was part of our continuous reexamination, was maintainability. As it's been mentioned multiple times, BGP gets a lot of extensions. Many of them are completely optional versus each other. The challenge becomes, yes, go ahead.
I think Rob was in the queue for the last slide.
Oh, I'm sorry, I did not have myself scrolled up. Please go ahead, Rob.
Just to say, speaking as an, I'll turn out to mouth. I'm working with so speaking as an individual, and assuming all comments in this discussion are speaking as such, I think for me, one of the sort of benefits of doing this modelling work is hopefully over time, it will lead towards the industry sort of consolidating towards a more standard management interface, because I think that'll benefit primarily customers and things who are using these devices, that the more commonality there is, the better that is. And so one observation there, and I'm not sure it's happening that well at the moment, is if IETF reaches a case where it has good coverage of the standard protocol features, I think in future it'd be good to push to try and get the YANG models designed and developed in conjunction with the features at the same time. So if the vendors are thinking about those management models at the same time they're designing the features, there's a much greater chance that they will be able to reach some sort of commonality and agreement on what those models should look like, rather than sort of trying to retrofit YANG models after vendors sort of design their separate user interfaces, and then trying to find the commonality is much harder that way around.
Right, that's an interesting set of points. Several of us on the call here are obviously old enough to remember the days when MIBs theoretically were a required piece of protocols, especially if you're trying to advance them in the standards process. YANG is thankfully significantly better than SMI was to do representation of things, and it means that doing it after the fact usually is one step less painful. And I agree with you, doing the work at the same time as you're actually designing the feature would be sort of ideal. I think the challenge we're going to run into is a little bit the same challenge we have for finding anybody that's willing to do modeling work at all. The skill set that it takes to do modeling is overlapping, but a little bit different than protocol design. And trying to force the two to happen maybe for the same author set may be an interesting challenge. I'm sure this is a conversation that ISG should take up at some point as part of long-term work. But my sort of initial proposal would be, we want to have the coupling. It's probably very helpful. I don't recommend it being a strong coupling, just simply because feature work should be able to advance, ideally at its own pace, with the manageability falling maybe a little bit afterwards, usually because of the iterative process of the protocol design itself. And as everybody on this call is very well aware, the industry is trying very hard to be good about not introducing non-backward compatible things as part of modeling work. If you tightly couple things, that thrash at the modeling end of things and the modules that get exposed to the end user base, gets thrashed as well, and that doesn't really help the industry. Mesh, go please.
The example that actually I wanted to talk about was the color definition that you were trying to add, for example, in the model. But to Rob's point, just like we require implementations, one or two implementations of anything that's supposed to become an RFC, I wonder if it would make sense that manageability be a requirement at the same time the definition or the RFC is being developed for that particular feature.
And Rob, you're still in the queue. Did you want to add anything further? Okay, Rob has taken himself out of the queue. Oh, he's re-added. Go ahead.
And that,
And he's out again. The joys of Meet Echo. Okay, let's move on to maintainability. As we're talking about how do you actually structure things, that's a big enough piece of work. Figuring out how can you actually add on, the next possible thing is itself an interesting challenge. So, asking the question, does this enable the future work is a important thing, and how do you go about doing that? In the case of you're developing a core module and then potentially adding in everything else via extensions, well, your work list is at least pre-built a little bit. This gives you a chance to say, here are the things that we already know we want to write later on, and you don't have to do the full modeling exercise, but being able to say, well, does this thing extend something that's already in the module? Is this thing completely off on the side? These are the sort of easy tests to figure out, is this the piece of work that is enabled right now in the current module, or am I somehow holding it back somehow? The sort of disruptive blocking behaviors is one that we're really looking to avoid, because you really can't undo those in an easy fashion. IETF does give us rules for basically replacing an entire module, but that is incredibly disruptive and certainly not something we care to do. Different groups have different standards in terms of the level of disruption they're willing to allow through the entire chain of modules they support. IETF aims towards stability, and this means a lot more forward thinking. One of the ways we try to actually solve this on our part was basically to do tests. And the test was, can we take something, augment it, even if it's a very basic augmentation. We're not really writing out the full module, but by doing enough of the skeletal extension on things, this lets us test that we actually have done our job correctly. Has the augmentation succeeded? And in a lot of cases, one of the things that we noticed is that groupings in particular, which are one part of nicety, just simply to group things together, the groupings in some cases needed to be reorganized to allow them to be attached in different places. Sometimes the groupings themselves, as part of doing the test, we realized that since you can't augment a grouping in the current version of Yang, the consequence is every place the grouping is instantiated, if you have to instantiate a augmentation for each one of those things, that itself is its own pain point. And certainly this is one of the known irritating quirks about Yang right now, and perhaps is one of the good things that will be part of Yang next. From a BGP perspective, we have a number of protocol extensions, especially the VPN-based ones that is managed by the BEST working group that's responsible for extending things. And we had to make sure that things that BEST wanted to support for like new BGP path attributes, new address families for features like multicast and Ethernet-based VPNs, were those things actually enabled? IDR that standardizes BGP itself regularly comes out with new extensions. Can we actually make sure that we can do those sorts of things? And interesting, much harder questions in some perspectives is extending incrementally features that are very flexible. And in particular, BGP extended communities is a headache that we'll come back to with some specific study, the type def slides, to talk about how this is actually really, really challenging, for something that's intended to be both flexible and highly maintainable. We also run into some of these headaches for like route targets and route distinguishers, which are used by the VPNs that had one version of modeling right now that are shipped in some RFCs that maybe long-term will need to change. This is where I pause and see if Mahesh wants to add anything here.
Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to also highlight the example that we're trying to develop the CLI, quote unquote, the CLI model to see if some of the popular CLI commands would work with the existing set of groupings.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I will skip actually displaying it for this round, just talk through it. And you know, if you all have time to go ahead and browse through the GitHub module that the BGP work is being done in, you'll find inside of there's actually one unused module not currently linked into the internet draft. And going through quite a bit of history in a very short order, when the BGP Yang module is being developed, people are trying to figure out structurally, how do you take two core pieces of BGP, the destinations themselves, the prefixes, and the sets of path attributes that go along with them, and model them inside of the Yang. And it's the case of the BGP protocol that you have a BGP update that contains one set of path attributes, which is a tuple of the properties of the routes, with a large number of prefixes that may be attached there. So you have a relationship of many prefixes to potentially one set of unique set of path attributes. And this sharing means that if you were to model this one for one, the consequence is that you'd end up with a potentially very noisy piece of modeling. And there's a set of design choices made that, well, perhaps we refactor these things so that the path attributes are a shareable component, where the individual routes then refer to it via some mechanism such as index, leafref, etc. And this is a perfectly fine way if you're doing, as an example, a get over the entire routing table to reduce the amount of noise in the system. Unfortunately, this modeling stuff, in terms of a pattern, well, correct modeling is got some interesting protocol challenges. As an example, if some set of path attributes A is shared by 5 or 6 different routes, well, that's great. You can serialize that individually as long as you're fetching the individual subtrees for the path attributes, and then fetching the subtrees for the routes. As long as you get the entire thing as one cluster, you have the data is made whole. The referential integrity is correct. The trouble we have with any of these types of streaming mechanisms, especially on change protocols, like pick something outside of IETF, GNMI from Google, means that you're getting some of this stuff streamed. There's no guarantees that you're going to get the things in any specific order, and sometimes there's no guarantee that you've even got a subscription to a subtree, like the path attributes, that's outside the routes themselves. So this ability to make whole the data becomes very challenging for anything that tries to do a structural separation for purposes of efficiency. If you're doing something like a CLI, this is even more challenging. CLIs don't split these things out. You actually stream out, if you do a show BGP route on pretty much any implementation, it's going to show the route, and it's going to show all the properties for the route. It's not going to refactor these things for efficiency. To try to enable things like the CLIs and potentially some types of streaming applications, we did an exercise. We basically said, well, could we put together a model that is a commands-based module? So if you did equivalent of a show BGP route on some platform, could it stream out for this destination all the sets of attributes associated with it? And as part of that exercise, we realized that, well, we were most of the way there. All the things that were already inside of the path attributes already had most of the right organization. And with a slight tweaking of the groupings, we got pretty much 100% reusability. And this means that for the same data, you can fold it into multiple different types of views and provide the ability to have the information represented better for specific applications. Where this runs into an interesting set of headaches, which people on this call will have opinions about. It's great that you can potentially enable multiple applications, but if you had these things implemented out of the box as separate trees, if you try to pull all the trees, you're effectively getting highly redundant data. So this operational view nicety versus structure is an interesting, I think, long-term conversation. Rob, I see your hand up.
Have I got audio? Yes. So similar to this, or related to this, is probably a sort of templating where you might embed templates either within the model or more generically for the configuration and allow you to write a very concise configuration. And then you have the same sort of question about how do you represent the operational data for those things, where you do that template expansion that naturally you would do, you'd see like the expanded operational data, but then obviously what can be quite a concise template going in on the configuration side ends up being sort of expanded out to a much larger amount of operational data. And so that's an interesting case to also consider, and somewhat similar to what you're describing, I think.
Exactly. And groupings, unfortunately, as we were saying earlier, they're very nice in the sense that they provide us, some ability to make reuse of things, but unfortunately, their long-term maintainability, you can't augment a grouping. That's where things become interesting, longer-term challenges for especially configuration. Okay, let's move on to the next point. And we'll actually pause from the slides in a moment to go out to some GitHub to actually talk about this. Type versioning is actually one of the interesting pieces of headache that we have for certainly BGP, and I suspect the problem exists in different flavors for other protocols. Hopefully, as the IETF is reviewing the modules, they're looking at these sorts of headaches. In particular, anything that needs to be extensible as a type, ideally long-term, if it's moving at a fast pace, if something's changing often, we're doing the work to delegate these types to IANA. The IANA process theoretically will allow us to make changes without having to go through and issue a completely brand new RFC for things, to basically copy and paste the same bit of data over and over again. Exactly how well that process will work over the long term, I think, is still to be discovered. But minimally, we need the ability to change these things in a flexible fashion, and we need the ability to do so in a lighter weight than basically having to BIS an entire module every single time. Mahesh, did you want to interject right here?
Okay. The point I was trying to also add to it is there currently exist, I believe, no guidelines as to when a particular set of definitions can or should be part of an IANA module instead of an IETF module. And I've had people query me on that particular question. So maybe this is more to Rob to say, maybe at an ISG level, we should have some color or definition for what is what's appropriate to put in an IANA module and what should be still maintained as an IETF module.
Yeah, in particular, to take something outside of the complicated pieces, so like the extended community type work. And Michael Richardson asked about good use of identities. We'll come to that as an example in a moment. For things that are code points in particular, there's a niceness to having the things published in a data type that very strongly binds their type and the code points they represent together. And Yang gives us a lot of different options for just boring numbers. We have enums, but enums are not trivial to maintain on their own. You have to go through a module update. That's an example where the fact that you want to have the number and you want to have the thing that they're tied to strongly put together, that's a good place to do an IANA maintain module. Other people have taken advantage of using identities. We talk about that a little bit the next point here. In cases where the things may, the code points themselves may not be super important, you can model them as a base identity or a set of identities, having an appropriate relationship. Yang versioning rules let us actually extend identities without actually having to worry about a republish of the module. So we get incremental maintenance without needing to centrally publish them. But one of your challenges is, even though you have the ability to do the extensions, well, you then have a question of where does the thing live? If your base module is part of a RFC, and you have a base identity as part of that, you can certainly have your augmentations for other things in a second RFC. But the challenge then becomes, if you have that potentially becomes a identity itself that is being derived from, and this is effectively a practice we want to avoid, identities from identities. The consequence there is that you start having dependency chains. One way to sort of work around some of those interesting headaches is to encourage the identities, even though they don't have to be maintained in a central place, to push them towards a central place like IANA. So we can get examples there. The BGP module does this as an example for its various types of capabilities. And a different example is the IGP modules that have been defined by LSR makes good advantage of doing things via identities rather than enums. Pause here to see. Rob, question?
A comment actually. So to answer Mahesh's question as to when is it good to do an IANA maintained module, my instinct here is if you've got another table already defined of attributes or properties defined in IANA, and you can programmatically sort of generate the YANG module from that, be that either identities or an enumeration or something like that, then I think that those fit quite well as something that's IANA maintained, because whenever that master table is updated, then IANA can automatically generate an updated version of the YANG module to go with it. In other cases where you need some sort of expert input into what's being generated and updated, those I think is more on the line as to probably that might be better going through a working group, but not necessarily the case. But that's just my rough instinct as to what the split should be.
Any follow-up, Mahesh?
Yeah, actually, that was I remembered what prompted my comment was somebody asking, does the code point need to exist in IANA for it to be in an IANA module? And I think, Rob, you kind of clarified that there are two instances. One where a code point might exist, and that would be one way reason to have an IANA module. The other cases where it may not be IANA code point, and the question there is it appropriate or is it okay for it to be in an IANA module? And I'll pause for the response.
Reply to that one. I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule, but having said that, from what I recall, everything that's there today always is a separate registry. I mean, the one that's probably slightly strange is the IF types, which I think is added to an IF types list that might be, and then a MIB is generated from, and the YANG is perhaps generated from that same list. So I think in all the cases that I can think of, there already is a separate table for the attributes, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not sure that's a hard and fast rule though.
Right. And examples of where enums versus identities, have some interesting overlaps here. If IANA is controlling a central enum, it's 100% clear that a given code point has been assigned to an application. If you have a feature that's done via identity, if somebody defines a internet draft, that defines an extension that's that's extending that identity, are they squatting on a code point or not? Because there's no magic number associated aside from the stuff in the descriptive text. So one of the things I encourage people to think about in terms of their IANA process and how this actually interacts with IANA and the ISG is what level of enforcement mechanisms we can get in terms of trying to avoid code point squatting, which can cause all sorts of interesting headaches. So I'm going to touch upon BGP extended communities because this is probably our single biggest pain point that we ran into as part of trying to figure out how do we clean up what's inside the module. BGP extended communities are used by the various VPN protocols. Fundamentally, they're just a 8-byte long thing that the first 2 bytes define a type and subtype, and the rest of it is sort of selected based on that type and subtype. And BGP is quite happy to pass these things around without necessarily understanding their contents, but all the various protocol mechanisms that use about them care very deeply about what this stuff is. Pick easy examples of that. Route targets out of VPNs are a explicit type about that, and they have more than one format. And the choice for modeling was made to, for use of operations, just like we have inside of our CLIs. People don't want to put in a 8-byte hexadecimal number to get stuff done. They're going to use things that are human friendly. This means they're going to be able to type in something like route-target :100:200. This means that from a Yang perspective, two things. We need to define a type for them, and we need to define a regular expression that allows them to be matched against. And unfortunately, this means that we have this gigantic growing set of regular expressions because this is attached to a generic feature, the extended community, that just happens to be used in specific contexts. This is where I jump out of our presentation mode and very briefly go into a screen share. And I'll need somebody to approve that, please. Jason, Kent, or Lou.
Sorry, what happened there? The slides dropped?
Nope, I'm trying to share my screen so I can do that, and then I'll be presenting after that.
Okay. It didn't ask me for permissions to share your screen. When you tried it, is it?
I have a screen share request going on right now. So there should be a approval dialog under your admin stuff.
Yeah, there should be under mine, but I'm not seeing it. Kent or Lou?
Kent has actually done it. There we go.
Okay, looks good.
Oh, actually, no, it's back to sharing deck. I don't want to share deck. I need to share screen. Let me cancel. I'll click it again. Hopefully one of you can see it. And you should see an actual screen share request now.
Hey, Jeff, I saw your request briefly, but it disappeared, so I wasn't able to click on it, but I don't know if one of the chairs did. It seemed to disappear on me.
Kent, could you go on mic and let us know what you see?
Maybe try again. So I apologize, Jeff. Maybe try one more time. I don't know if one of the chairs is clicking on it before I'm getting to it.
I'm going to cancel it and then reinitialize. Okay, I have clicked share screen. Well, so much for having tested this earlier. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, trying to fight through the UI here. So let me go back to presenting the slides, I guess, and then I'll just talk through the point.
Yeah,
So
sorry,
Jeff,
Jeff. I saw it come up, but I wasn't able to do anything about it. I'm not sure why. Maybe as secretary, I don't have the right permissions. I'm not sure.
So Jeff, before you resume, there is a question on the chat panel from Michael.
Yeah, he was asking about the identities, and I gave examples that we do have some inside the BGP module, and we also have several excellent ones inside of the IGP modules as well for like OSPF and ISIS. So apparently my request to share anything is not doing anything, so I'll need one of the chairs to actually reshare the screen and pass it back to me.
I can try. If you request, I think I can give you permission.
Okay, so let's do the screen share one last time. Yes, I really want to share my screen. Thank you, Lou. So this should actually come through now. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now. So again, we were talking about extended communities, and we have not only things like route targets, route origins, other things like that. We also have things that include features that are very popular in IETF right now, like colors. So the color community was originally developed as part of RFC 9012. I'm not going to flash that up on the screen, but poking to our packet diagram here, because that's mostly from 9012. We have, again, it's 8 bytes worth of data. There's a type, there's a subtype, and then the bottom 4 octets were color. In the original RFC, the prior 2 octets were basically must be zeros. And the question becomes, well, what happens if you want to extend these sorts of things? And the SRTE policy feature, which is being done in support of a lot of more interesting segment routing type use cases for with BGP as a signaling plane, decided that they wanted to take 2 bits of this and actually make use of them. So the question becomes, how do you model this sort of thing? And part of our process here is, this is an example. We said, well, we want to add, and this is inside of the GitHub that we've been doing our coordination work. We want to add support for this sort of thing. We talk about where it came from, and then the fact that there's a modeling challenge here. And as an example, we show the OC model that they've done for their stuff, and they made an interesting choice. They decided to model those first 2 bits strictly as a 0 and 1, 2 bits long, and then a colon. So the question is, what do you do about this sort of thing, especially as it changed? If you have a standard 9012 implementation that doesn't understand the flags field, do you want to model those bits at all? It's not actually relevant. If you do understand it, well, that's great. We can display the 2 bits that we do know what to do from this extension RFC that's coming up, and we can model it this way. The question is, what happens if we start adding further bits? Maybe we add the next 2. Flipping over to this presentation here. Actually, sorry, go back to the IETF one. So if we add in the next 2 bits, do we just simply continue adding in zeros and ones, much like we have for the Yang bit string? Or what happens if we have a different example where instead of that, somebody decides they want to grab the bottom 2 bits? How do you represent that? You backfill all the zeros. So this is an interesting set of choices that we have to deal with for maintainability, on top of the fact that we have to actually update a type def that is used by everybody. And the example that we came up with for ours is we're going to add on a field designator. So this CO flag to say these 2 bits have been designated as the color only type flags, and this allows us to model this explicit set of choices. And later on, if we decide to add other things, we could also put on different flag fields as well. This means that regular expressions written against this extended community have a chance of being extensible in the future. This is still not a great pattern. We'll have some of the same challenges that we have for what happens when you add things that are present in the protocol but not actually signaled. So this example going back to here, what happens if somebody sets one of these unassigned bits? It's present. You can't configure it using one of these magic types. You can't print it. So the challenge becomes, how do you sort of fall back in your display model? Well, the answer that we have for extended communities in general is we have the ability to display raw communities that are the raw hex format. Those are guaranteed not to change from release to release. It means we have, to some extent, overlaps of known human-friendly communities and the ones that are raw. And the sort of headache we're seeing is a pattern sort of repeatedly as we're working through the operational cases for BGP. How do you deal with the unknowns? And there's at least one bit of this discussion that we're having about bit vectors that is carried through into other proposals. So I'll pause here to see if there's any questions about this explicit example. Okay, and just to point out the relevant bits of process, we're doing this exactly like you do with any other Git project. We opened up issues, we have discussions about it, we work through the details of things, and eventually we'll get around to crafting a pull request, which we have one pending. At the moment, we've decided this is not a core piece of the feature, and this is left as a lingering pull request. It's possible that IDR, as part of working through the RFC process, will decide they want to integrate this. But at some point, there will have to be the internet answer for this because it's a protocol extension that's defined. So Lou, I'm going to switch back and request you to share the slides again and pass it back to me. Okay, thank you, Kent. These are all named very similarly, so I'm going to just pick one and hope. So one of our learnings here is that switching back and forth can be challenging. Okay, so resuming in slide 7, type versioning, like I said, is a extremely painful thing when you're dealing with string types that have regular expressions used as their validating elements on there. We have some interesting challenges just for how these things were defined originally. Part of the routing working group work was to try to actually provide common types for various protocols, including BGP. And 8294 gave us some primitives for route target, route origins, route distinguishers. Unfortunately, they probably made some modeling mistakes right there. They don't provide for suitable extensibility. They also don't make it terribly easy for you to do any updates. They didn't delegate this to IANA, so the consequence is if you wanted to maintain something in 8294, there will have to be an entire BIS. Ideally, that entire BIS, once we actually start addressing the deficiencies we found as part of working on the BGP modules, and as we continue working on the VPN modules, will be to push this off to IANA. The main headache that we have in terms of the modeling is there's some ambiguity in the strings that they developed, especially the lack of qualifying keywords. If you look at most CLIs and do a show of some sort, you do like a show BGP route, and you'll see that this has route target, :100, :200 as an example. That route target keyword is the thing that makes it unambiguous as to what the thing is actually present. In the modeling that they did, they just simply chose to put in the raw 100, :200 numbers. That means you have to know the context, and as long as the context is completely unambiguous, if this is used solely as configuring targets for a VPN VRF as an example, then that's sort of safe. But if you're trying to display this among a list of all the different types of extended communities, of which route target's one of, well, it's no longer semantically clear. So that's the thing we'll have to decide about revisions as we work on the things in IETF. And our third point here, bit fields. There's a presentation I gave on this point at last IETF. Very briefly reviewed here. Yang does an excellent job in terms of defining bit fields as a core protocol, as a core language element when they're defined. So you can identify bit 0 means this, bit 1 means that. That's great. The problem is what happens when you have operational state for implementations that can receive things that might be an older version. So if bit 3, bit 4, bit 5 gets assigned later on, but you're unfortunately running an older version, well, the implementation can see it. The thing that you're passing through your implementation may contain those bits. You may not be able to see it, but it may be impacting something further downstream in the protocol. So visibility is a very important thing from an operational standpoint. The bits construct doesn't really give us the necessary tool. So the problem we have is sort of twofold. there's no way to assign default names to these bits. The consequence there is that if something is getting sent on the wire, you can't show that it's present. That goes back to our extended community example for colors for those unassigned bits as an example. And just as messy, you can't change the name of the bit once it's been assigned, which means if you want to actually give it a name, you're not allowed to change it, from like unknown 3 to this is now the color 4 as an example. The proposal for the unknown bits that I made is one potential technique for dealing with this, and it's generated a lot of interesting discussion in terms of whether these things are backward compatible changes or not. I suggest let's not take a huge amount of time on this presentation for it, but let's please continue that conversation in NetMod. Pause here to see if there's any questions. Go ahead, Mahesh.
No, I just unmuted simply because I was getting ready for the next slide.
It's your show.
All right. So I was going to talk a little bit about examples and the need to have them in the drafts, not just for what we were trying to do, but in general, as a suggestion to anyone who's actually writing a Yang module. I think it helps multifold. One is, as I talk about, as you're developing the model, any changes you make, does it break your existing model in any way? And that's an obvious reason to have plenty of examples in your repo. Now you might choose to either share them in the draft or not, but I would share them simply because from an implementation or somebody who is actually trying to use those models can then use your examples to build upon. So I think our philosophy is that there can never be enough number of examples in the draft. So more would certainly be helpful. Even within the examples, I've seen snippets and not necessarily complete configuration examples. And that's better than having no examples, but it certainly helps if one can see in that particular example how you are pulling in data for other modules that you have not necessarily developed. So if you look at the example 8.5 in our draft, it's not just concentrating on example as it relates to the BGP, but also the other modules that it's dependent on. So highly encourage anyone who's writing models to try to develop examples for it. Jason?
Hi. So Mahesh, when you mentioned that, like, I agree, the examples are often very, very, very useful, and I found them in developing Yang models as well, is to have some instance data examples for myself to kind of validate in my mind. Oh, here's what it looks like when you kind of put it together. But you mentioned that it would also help detect when you make some changes and it breaks, like previous configs. So I assume by that what you mean is not just have the examples, but you also are validating those instance data examples against the models using like YangLint or something as you churn things, like to have almost like an approval pipeline as you're churning the module.
That is correct. And what I was going to do as part of another demo, if we are able to ever pull up the repo in my case, is to actually show exactly what you mentioned, which is using YangLint and an instance data file, whether it's XML or JSON, and run it against your model. So if you made any changes and you forgot, oops, I forgot to either remove or change a particular leaf, then that example is able to catch that and tell you either you
There.
modify the
Okay.
example or you modify the
Thanks.
model. Any other questions?
Yeah, I gotta point out for this particular slide, the TCP/M module that had been coming out was through their last call, had been through the Young Doctors review, and we were asked to go ahead and take a look at it because BGP is a protocol, uses TCP. We want to make sure that we can interoperate with it for things like TCP/AO and MD5. And it was the process of writing our interop examples that we found deficiencies in the current TCP/M module at that time, and that ended up halting their last call. They got some changes made. We proved that the modules interworked at that point, and we were able to proceed forward. So this is an excellent example of publishing something without trying to use it can be problematic.
All right, this is the correct version of the slide. So schema mount was one other area that was that we started to look at fairly early. Although one of the issues that we ran into was that there were no public tools available for us to actually validate. So going back to that example scenario, even though we had an example, we didn't have any tools to validate it. But ever since then, I believe Yangland has added support. So the plan is for us to, of course, revalidate the schema mount example that we have in the draft. But why do we need schema mount? Well, if you look at the BGP model, it is already augmenting the routing protocol model to add the particular BGP instance. Now, in that particular scenario, routing protocols rarely, of course, run in isolation. They usually are realized inside of a network instance, even if it's a default network instance. So how does one augment an already augmented model? One of the ways to, of course, deal with it that IETF has defined is using schema mount. OpenConfig, of course, decided that they were going to address that by making sure that all routing instances are always realized under network instance, and you had no flexibility in changing that. IETF, on the other hand, has decided that it will offer the option of schema mount, where you can essentially draft or graft a particular model under any other model and create its own hierarchy. So BGP in this case, because it was already augmenting the network model, the routing model, decided to use schema mount and mount the routing model under network instance. The global instance, of course, of BGP can be realized in that case running under a default network instance for those that don't want to necessarily run instances under a particular WRF. But even doing that, an example to demonstrate how that schema mount can be done was important for us. And that's why we decided to add that example in the draft. And as I mentioned earlier, that example is, of course, based on existing RFC examples that are there, either in the routing or in the network instance RFCs. So we are hoping that with the tools now being available, and especially Yangland, we'll be able to validate schema mount. Jason. your question.
Hey, it's just more a time check. I think we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left on the Meet Echo. I don't know if it'll keep going past that for a few extra minutes, but we should probably just make sure we kind of hit on key messages in the next 5 minutes, and then anything, if it lets us hang around for another 5 or 10 after that, that's a bonus, but I'm not positive what'll happen.
Okay, actually, I'll hand it back to Jeff at this point to cover the remaining slides.
Okay, and we should be able to easily finish this by top of hour, and we'll try to compress, the key points down, next 5 minutes, and give Mahesh a chance to actually show a very, very, very brief demo of changes in the ecosystem he built. So again, revisiting this point, module interwork was a very big deal. We've already reviewed a number of places where this was an interesting set of challenges. As an example, how do we actually do TCP/AO, TCP/MD5, IPsec? How do we make these things actually work with BGP? How do we integrate with things like policy, which was itself its own growing thing, and some of the back and forth that we had between this module in IDR and the routing working groups policy module that was under their development but had substantial need to accommodate BGP. That was one of our sets of challenges, and BFD itself, as people who are involved in that bit of Yang work was itself a headache in terms of maintenance. It had to have a small patch issued against it very soon after original publication. So verifying we could actually do all these things is critical. A lot of this, again, is coming back to try the examples, test the integration. We will find bugs. We did find bugs, and we found bugs in like 4 different of the pieces that we tried to work with. IPsec had already long been published. They don't have a specific piece of work at the moment open to fix their problems, but this is an example at the bottom. We don't have a gating process in IETF review to make sure that not only is the module good Yang, or if it's valid protocol components, but if it's referring to something else or intended to be used by something else, is the data able to be done, and can that interwork actually occur? Collaboration was a important thing here. This process went on a very long time. As mentioned earlier on, it was a cluster of original authors, and then the OC folk joined, and then split off, and then it sort of lingered for a while, and eventually sort of hit a stale point before we started getting further involvement. And the consequence was, if you can't move at a fast pace, how do you actually make sure that important things aren't lost? And even if you are moving at a fast pace and iterating quickly, how do you make sure that you're making lots of different point changes to the documents? Are things corrected each step of the way? And these are exactly the same problems that standard software development has. So this project has used GitHub for a very long time. Mahesh has done a wonderful job of building us an environment for this. And GitHub itself gave us a lot of the structural components we needed to get the job done. Issues were created, we track things, we tag them. Once we decided to work on a given cluster of things, we'd generate pull requests, we had cross review, we were making sure to review these against various implementations to figure out how closely we're matching the real world. In cases where we didn't have no good agreement, the issues will provide documentation, perhaps long-term, especially if we archive things, as to why we made some of the design choices. Problems. We didn't have enough eyes in the work, and this is a generic problem with modeling in IETF. Review ends up happening effectively very late because we've published an RFC and then some vendors trying to implement the thing. We have a lag between implementation and the RFC status process. Ideally, we'd have something better to do about that, but based on where the industry is in terms of IETF Yang modules, that's not happening right now. For us, trying to close some of these loops, doing all these testing components, verifying we can actually maintain things, the containerized build environment Mahesh put together for us did a huge amount to make sure that everybody, in a single Git checkout with Docker, has everything they need to build the modules, do the validation, build the resulting internet draft text. This is all in one spot. It means that you also have a consistent version of each of the tools in the tool chain. And we'll go ahead and briefly touch on the next two remaining slides, and then yield to Mahesh to actually show you what the environment looks like. Some brief conclusions. One of the best things we could have done is found a way to do this in less time. And the BGP Yang work, if you look at the draft, is probably the largest module we have in IETF by at least 3x. Consequences, it's just going to require a lot more eyeballs on there, and it required iteration, and iterating over something that large is very difficult. Just simply getting all the content in itself, you checked, you rechecked, you rechecked. Eventually, you stop seeing things. You need more eyes. And even if you have eyes, reviewing things, it's the same problem. We do have to get the structure right the first round. We found that we actually had several mistakes in, and we found that out late in the process. Conveniently, we're still pre-implementation, so this was not actually a broken thing. The tooling and the maintainability, and most importantly, the testing that's part of the environment that will be demonstrated, that makes a huge difference. IESG in particular needs to pay strong attention to what we delegate to IANA, how that actually goes into the code point management process, and what, if any, type of squatting can take effect when things are defined through identities. And emphasizing very hard again, interwork has to be tested. This is where we will actually find problems in IETF. Some brief GitHub stats, 200 issues open and 135 pull requests. And a lot of these passes were back and forths against IETF as we were working on it, and OC. So this is where I'm going to ask Lou to wake up and allow Mahesh to share a screen.
Not sure if Lou is on the call, but hopefully we will try this myself. So apparently we have to stop sharing the preloaded slides, which looks like maybe you've done. So Mahesh, if you want to make a request, let's see what happens there.
Do you see my request?
Yeah, it looks like a screen is being shared.
Oh,
this is going to work.
You know what? Unfortunately, because of permissions, I will have to restart and relog in. So maybe this we might have to just skip it for this time.
Okay, it started. It started thinking it was sharing.
Oh, let me see if it'll let me share it. No, it's saying I have a Mac permission denied problem at my end.
Oh, on your Mac. Okay.
Okay. There are several slides here, so I don't know which one. Maybe this. Okay. Okay. I think that was the end of the slide presentation, and we'll have to skip over the demo. The demo that Jeff was referring to was the containerized environment that we have. What it essentially does is it has, and as Jeff mentioned, the set of tools that we were able to share consistently across all the authors, because each individual laptop had its own, otherwise would have its own tool set. Some tools that were available, some were different versions. And rather than debugging or working on the model itself, we were spending time trying to figure out why the versions of the draft were different. So having a Docker containerized way to build the draft was suddenly neutralized any differences. The other part that is not necessarily part of the container environment was that, and this is something I learned through other authors, is keep the models separate from the draft itself, so that the models could be compiled, they could be validated and tested before being included in the draft. And there are enough scripts around that maybe should be shared that can be used to then include those models into the draft as part of the build process. So those are some lessons or tool sets that I think would be helpful for anyone who's trying to develop a Yang model from scratch. Anything I missed, Jay? Jeff? Sorry, Rob, you had a question.
Not a question. I was just going to reiterate my thanks to both of you for both presenting here and the work you've done on here. I think the one about the sort of the tooling aspect, I think that would be really good to share, because that wouldn't take very long to share either in ops area or maybe RTGWG to give people sort of guidance on how to do this stuff. I think all that stuff is great and helpful. So if you're willing and can find the time and energy to present that the next IETF meeting, I think that could be quite a good thing to present on. I think this is all very interesting as well. You obviously can't fill a whole slot with this, though.
Absolutely, I'll share that.
Yeah, an ideal outcome from that particular piece from it is we end up with basically an empty blank container, which can then be used as the default development environment for people doing new work.
Rashad?
Yeah, I just want to add to what you said, Mahesh, regarding the use of GitHub and all that. When we were working on the BFD stuff, you had done all the build environment and having the model separate and validation of the examples. That was all done automatically, and it really helped. So I just want to say +1 to what you said.
Thanks.
Well, I guess to offer my closing remarks, this has been a long journey. We're still not to the point of implementations yet, although we have rumors that some are starting to make progress for the BGP stuff. And the consequence of the work that we've done hopefully has helped make all the other things that we're working with a little bit better as well. So hopefully this has been helpful, and my hope is that this group will take the wisdom, spread it around elsewhere, and ideally let's write down some of these things as best practices and disseminate them, whether it's internet drafts, wiki entries, etc., so that the rest of the people who want to get started in IETF Yang work have a good place to start.
Okay, and thanks all. And on behalf of the chairs, NetMod, thanks a lot, guys. I know it's a lot of your time to have arranged this and take the time to present it. So I think that pretty much wraps up this interim. Unless someone else has something else they want to add, closing moments here. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see a lot of you at IETF.
See you in San Francisco.
Bye all.